The year is 2009. The air over the Dorset Ridgeway in southern England is cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth. A mechanical digger, carving a path for a new relief road, scrapes against something that is not chalk. It is bone. What unfolds over the next few months is a slow, meticulous exhumation of a forgotten crime. Archaeologists from Oxford Archaeology unearth a mass grave, a shallow pit containing the skeletal remains of 54 individuals. But this is not a chaotic battlefield burial. This is something colder, more methodical. The bodies are all young men, mostly in their late teens or early 20s. They are all decapitated. Their heads are not missing. They are piled neatly to one side of the pit. For 51 of the skeletons, the head was severed from the front, a brutal, face-to-face act of execution. The cuts are clean, made by a very sharp, heavy blade, likely a sword. Yet the bodies are tangled together, stripped of their clothing and possessions, tossed into the grave like refuse. Isotope analysis performed by the British Geological Survey on their tooth enamel will later tell a story of long journeys. These men were not locals. They grew up in the far north, across Scandinavia, some from within the Arctic Circle. They were Vikings. And here, on a lonely English hill, they met an end not in the heat of battle, but as prisoners, subjected to a systematic and deeply personal slaughter by their Anglo-Saxon captors. This single, macabre discovery forces a question that haunts the entire Viking Age. What truly happened to the defeated when the swords were cleaned and the shields put down? The legends speak of glory and heroic last stands. The cold earth of Dorset whispers of something else entirely, a calculated, ritualized brutality worse than any saga. The scene at Ridgeway Hill is a forensic puzzle written in bone. The archaeologists noted the absence of battle trauma on the skeletons. There were few parry fractures on the arms, no arrowheads embedded in ribs. These men were captured, disarmed, and then killed. The execution was a performance. Evidence of hesitation marks on the vertebrae of some victims suggests the executioner was not always skilled, or perhaps the victims struggled. 3 heads were not with the main pile but placed with the bodies, one on the chest, another between the legs, a third in place of a missing hand. This was not simple killing. It was a statement, a post-mortem mutilation intended to send a message, not just to the living but about the dead. This kind of burial, known in archaeological terms as a deviant burial, is a recurring, macabre signature across the Viking world and its frontiers. It points to a deep-seated belief that death was not a final end, but a transition that could be manipulated. To kill an enemy was one thing. To ensure they stayed dead, that their spirit could not return to haunt or harm, required a different kind of violence. This was necromancy in reverse, not raising the dead, but pinning them down for eternity. The Ridgeway Hill grave is a stark prelude to a wider investigation into the post-battle practices of the Norse. It forces us to look beyond the chaotic clash of the shield wall and into the grim, ritualized spaces that came after. The execution block, the sacrificial grove, and the unhallowed ground where enemies were disposed of, their bodies and souls deliberately desecrated to neutralize their power. The sagas are filled with heroic deaths, but the soil tells a story of fear, a visceral terror of the defeated enemy's enduring spirit. To understand this calculated cruelty, we must first understand the Viking mindset, a worldview forged in a harsh landscape and governed by an unforgiving code of honor. The Viking Age, stretching roughly from 793 to 1066, was not an era of lawless chaos. It was an age of intricate, if brutal, social rules. Law was paramount. Disputes were settled, contracts made, and punishments meted out at regional assemblies called a thing. Killing was not necessarily a crime, but the way you killed mattered. An open killing declared publicly could be settled with a fine, the wergild or man price paid to the victim's family. It was a matter of honor. But a secret killing, a murder done in the dark and concealed, was a shameful act that made the perpetrator an outlaw, a vargur I acute veum, a wolf in a holy place, who could be killed on sight. This distinction is crucial. It shows that for the Norse, the context and performance of violence were everything. After a battle, this legal and social framework was applied to prisoners of war. Their fate was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate choice between three primary paths: ransom, enslavement, or execution. The wealthy and well-connected might be ransomed, their lives converted back into the silver that fueled the Viking economy. The common warrior, if he survived, was often fated for a life as a thrall, a slave, his identity erased and his future a long, grinding misery. But for a hated enemy, a rival chieftain, or an oath breaker, a third option was reserved: a death that was also a message, a public spectacle of domination and retribution. The concept of a good death was central to the Norse warrior ethos. To die in battle, weapon in hand, was the ideal, a guarantee of a place in Valhalla, but to die a straw death of old age or sickness in a bed was seen as ignominious, and to die a shame death was the worst fate of all. This was a death designed to inflict maximum humiliation, to destroy an enemy's honor and legacy so completely that their memory would be a curse. The methods were varied and laden with symbolic meaning. Blinding, castration, or the severing of a hand or foot were not just punishments. They were ways of marking a person as powerless, of destroying their physical identity and social standing. Execution was a form of political theater. The chosen method was a reflection of the crime or the victim's status. For a common thief, it might be the gallows; for a sorcerer, stoning or drowning. But for a captured enemy leader, the death had to be memorable. It had to be a performance that reinforced the victor's power and permanently erased the vanquished honor. This is the logic that animates the most terrifying accounts in the sagas. It is why the victorious Jarl Hakon forces the defeated Jomsvikings to be executed one by one, to test their courage in the face of death. Each man's last words are recorded, their bravery or fear judged by their captors. The act of dying was the final test of a warrior's worth, and to orchestrate that act was the ultimate expression of power. The sagas, the great prose narratives of Iceland and Norway, are our primary textual window into this world. The Heimskringla, the Orkneyinga saga, the Egil saga, they are drenched in blood and obsessed with the intricate calculus of revenge. They detail executions with a chilling, matter-of-fact tone. Men are hanged, beheaded, thrown from cliffs, or burned alive in their halls. Yet we must approach these texts with a historian's caution. Most were written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, 200 years or more after the events they describe, by Christian authors looking back on their pagan ancestors. Are they accurate historical records, or are they literary creations, a form of historical fiction designed to shock and entertain a medieval audience? This is the central tension in the study of Viking violence. The stories are vivid, but the archaeological proof is often elusive. If you find value in this forensic approach, in weighing the tales of the sagas against the hard evidence dug from the cold earth, consider subscribing to The Sealed Room, because the search for truth often begins when we question the most famous stories, and what we find is frequently more disturbing than the original myth. The sagas provide the narrative, the alleged motive. But it is only when their claims align with the silent testimony of bone and bog that we can begin to glimpse the horrifying reality of what happened after the battle was over. Not all post-battle retribution was fatal. Sometimes the goal was not to end a life, but to ruin it, to inflict a spiritual wound so deep it would fester for generations. The most potent example of this was the creation of a nithstang, or scorn pole. This was not mere insult. It was a formal, ritualized act of magical warfare. The Egil saga gives a detailed, terrifying account of its construction. After being outlawed by King Eirik Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild, the poet-warrior Egil Skallagrimsson makes landfall in Norway. He takes a horse's head, impales it on a tall hazel pole, and turns the gaping, dead mouth towards the land. He then carves runes onto the pole and speaks a formal curse, a nith, declaring that he is directing this curse not only at the king and queen, but at the very Landvitir, the guardian spirits of the land itself, so that they will wander lost until Eirik and Gunhild are driven out. This was a declaration of total war, aimed at the foundations of the enemy's power, luck, and legitimacy. The horse's head was a potent symbol, an appeal to the chthonic, dark forces of the cosmos. The runes gave it legal and magical force. The spoken curse activated it. It was an act of profound psychological and spiritual terror designed to turn the enemy's own world, the very soil and spirits that sustained them, against them. It was a weapon that attacked not the body but the soul. The fear that animated the creation of the Nithstang, the belief in unseen forces and restless spirits, also explains the strange burials at Ridgeway Hill and other sites. The practice of decapitation and placing the head between the legs or at the feet of the corpse is a recurring pattern in deviant burials across northern Europe, from the Iron Age through the medieval period. An excavation at St. John's College, Oxford, in 2008 uncovered a 10th-century ditch containing 4 decapitated young men believed to be Viking raiders. Their heads were placed at their feet. The logic, according to scholars like Dr. Anders Winroth, was brutally simple: to prevent the dead from rising again. The Norse world was haunted by a belief in the draugr, the animated corpse of the dead. By separating the head, the seat of identity and consciousness, from the body, the corpse was rendered inert. It could not see its way out of the grave. It could not find its way back to the world of the living to wreak vengeance. This was a practical form of spiritual warfare, a supernatural security measure. Placing heavy stones on the body, driving stakes through the torso, or burying the corpse face down were other common techniques to pin the dead to the earth. These were not acts of random desecration. They were methodical, ritual procedures rooted in a deep and abiding fear of the enemy's power, a power that was believed to persist long after their last breath. The draugr was not a mindless, shuffling zombie. In Norse mythology and saga literature, it was a terrifying and formidable foe. It was the deceased individual, retaining their personality and malice, but now endowed with supernatural strength and a malevolent hatred for the living. The draugr could leave its burial mound, swell to an enormous size, and crush people to death, drive them mad, or blight the landscape. The Laxdæla saga tells of the shepherd Thorolfr, who is killed by a wicked man named Atrapper. After Atrapper is buried, he becomes a powerful draugr who haunts the valley, killing livestock and terrorizing the inhabitants until the hero Olafur Pi digs up his body, decapitates it, and burns it to ashes. This was the only sure way to destroy a draugr. The fear of creating such a monster, especially from the corpse of a powerful enemy warrior, was immense. A warrior who died with a grudge was the prime candidate to become a vengeful undead. Therefore, the post-mortem mutilation seen at sites like Ridgeway Hill was a preemptive strike. It was a recognition of the enemy's power, an admission of fear. The systematic decapitation was a community-wide effort to protect themselves, to ensure that the 54 dead Vikings they had executed would not return from their shallow grave to continue the war from beyond the veil of death. The violence was a form of exorcism. Of all the alleged Viking execution methods, none has captured the macabre imagination more than the blood eagle. Described in several sagas and poems, it is an act of supreme cruelty and ritual significance. The victim is laid face down, their ribs are severed from the spine with a blade, and their lungs are pulled out through the openings in their back, forming a pair of bloody wings. The act is presented as a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war, poetry, and death. It is allegedly performed on high-status enemies, most famously on King Aelle of Northumbria in revenge for his killing of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. For centuries, the blood eagle was accepted as a genuine historical practice, but in recent decades, a fierce scholarly debate has erupted. Skeptics, like historian Roberta Frank, argue that there is no clear contemporary evidence for the ritual. The descriptions are vague, contradictory, and grow more elaborate in later retellings. They suggest the entire concept may be a misunderstanding by Christian authors, who misinterpreted complex Old Norse poetry about carrion birds feasting on the backs of the slain. There is, to date, zero archaeological evidence of a victim of the blood eagle. The bone cuts required would be distinctive, yet no skeleton bearing them has ever been found. Is the blood eagle a horrifying reality of pagan sacrifice, or a literary invention, a piece of Christian propaganda designed to portray the pagan Northmen as monstrous barbarians? The jury is still out, leaving the blood eagle to haunt the line between history and legend. While the blood eagle remains debated, the reality of systematic political execution is undeniable. Victorious chieftains and kings used public executions to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and instill terror. The sagas provide numerous examples that ring with historical truth. After the pivotal naval battle of Hjörungavágr around 986, the victorious Jarl Håkon Sigurðarson captured a fearsome warband of elite mercenaries known as the Vikings. He had them brought ashore bound and sat on a log. One by one they were to be beheaded. The saga account in the Vikinga saga focuses on the men's defiant stoicism. One captive, when asked his thoughts on dying, says he is content, as he has fulfilled his oath. Another asks the executioner to strike him from the front, wanting to see the blow coming and promising not to flinch. He passes the test. A third captive mocks the executioner's fine hair, asking that it not be stained with his blood. This grim procession of defiant speeches and swift executions was not just about killing prisoners. It was a public demonstration of Håkon's absolute power and the unwavering courage of his enemies, which in a strange way honored both victor and vanquished. If the stories of our past, stripped of myth and presented with forensic clarity, are what you seek, take a moment to subscribe. We believe the truth is always more compelling than fiction, especially when it is written in blood and iron. This was power politics played out on a stage of execution, where a man's final moments became his ultimate political statement. The gallows held a particularly potent and dark significance in the Norse world, deeply intertwined with their chief god, Odin. Odin was not a benevolent father figure. He was the All-Father, but also the god of frenzy, of secrets, and of the slain. He was the master of the gallows, sometimes called Hangater, the god of the hanged. According to the poem Havamal, Odin himself hung for 9 nights on Yggdrasil, the world tree, wounded with a spear, sacrificing himself to gain the knowledge of runes. This foundational myth linked hanging with sacrifice, death, and the acquisition of sacred knowledge. Consequently, hanging an enemy was more than a mere execution. It could be a ritual act, a human sacrifice dedicating the victim to Odin. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing in the 11th century, provides a chilling, though possibly exaggerated, account of the great pagan temple at Uppsala in Sweden. He describes a sacred grove next to the temple where, every 9 years, a great festival was held. 9 males of every living creature were sacrificed. Their bodies hung from the branches of the trees. Adam states explicitly that this included men. While his account is that of a hostile Christian observer, it aligns with the mythological importance of hanging. To hang an enemy, especially in a sacred grove, was to deliver them directly to the god of war, to offer their life force in exchange for divine favor. It transformed a simple execution into a profound religious statement, the ultimate act of pagan devotion. Death, however spectacular or ritualized, was not the only fate for a defeated enemy. For every warrior executed on a blood-soaked field, many more were rounded up and assessed for their economic value. The Viking Age was powered as much by commerce as by conflict, and the most valuable, self-transporting commodity was the human being. A high-ranking captive, a jarl or a bishop, was a source of immense potential wealth through ransom. Negotiations could be complex, the sums astronomical, paid in silver, gold, land, or political concessions. Their life was a bargaining chip in the high-stakes diplomacy of the age. For the common warrior, however, the future was far bleaker. Captured and disarmed, he was no longer a soldier but a thrall. His identity was stripped away, his legal rights non-existent. He became property, to be worked to death on a farm in Norway, sold in the great slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby, or shipped down the river systems of Russia to be traded for Arab silver in the markets of the Byzantine Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate. This was the cold, economic logic that ran parallel to the hot-blooded desire for revenge. An enemy could be a sacrifice to the gods, a symbol of humiliation, or a column in a ledger. The choice depended entirely on the needs and ambitions of the victor. For thousands of defeated soldiers, the end of the battle was not the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a new, living hell, their fate determined not by honor or piety, but by profit. Let us return, finally, to the cold earth of the Dorset Ridgeway. The forensic science applied to the skeletons of the 54 executed Vikings reveals a story more complex and more poignant than a simple tale of English revenge. The isotope analysis, published in the Antiquity Journal, showed that these men came from across the Norse world. One individual's signature matched that of the region north of the Arctic Circle. This was not a homogeneous army. It was a diverse warband, a collection of adventurers, mercenaries, and raiders united under a single banner, seeking wealth in a foreign land. Their execution, dated to somewhere between 970 and 1025 AD, was equally deliberate. They were Vikings, yes, but they were also prisoners of war, executed without honor by local Anglo-Saxon forces. This flips the script. It shows that the brutal, ritualized violence we associate with the Vikings was not unique to them. It was a shared language of terror and control in a violent age. The Anglo-Saxons who beheaded these men and buried them in a deviant fashion were likely motivated by the same fears that drove the Norse: the fear of the enemy's spirit, the need for a public display of power, and the desire for definitive, brutal closure. The grave at Ridgeway Hill is a testament to a cycle of violence, where the perpetrators of one raid became the victims of the next execution, their own beliefs and methods turned against them with chilling precision. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries fundamentally changed the spiritual landscape, but it did not extinguish the region's penchant for spectacular cruelty. The justifications changed, but the methods often remained eerily familiar. The pagan sacrifice was reframed as righteous punishment for heresy or treason. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, a zealous early Christian convert, was infamous for his brutal methods of persuasion. Sagas record him torturing and executing pagan holdouts by having serpents forced down their throats or by placing a bowl of red-hot coals on their stomachs. St. Olaf II, the patron saint of Norway, was no less ruthless in his consolidation of Christian power, blinding, maiming, and executing his rivals with the same ferocity as his pagan predecessors. The political theater of execution continued unabated. The old gods were replaced by the new god, but the use of the body as a canvas for displaying power remained a constant. The line between a pagan human sacrifice and a Christian execution for blasphemy could be perilously thin, often distinguished only by the symbols invoked and the prayers uttered by the executioner. The deep cultural grammar of violence, developed over centuries of pagan warfare and ritual, was not erased by the cross. It was simply given a new vocabulary, a new divine mandate for the same cold, hard acts of power. The true horror of the Viking Age lies not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, calculated aftermath. It is found in the quiet moments after the shouting dies down, when choices are made about the living and the dead. It is the logic of the executioner at Ridgeway Hill, severing a head from the front to look his victim in the eye. It is the magical thinking of the chieftain planting a horse's head on a pole, believing he can curse the very earth his enemy walks on. It is the deep, primal fear that drives a community to mutilate a corpse, lest it rise from its grave. These acts, more than any chaotic shield wall clash, reveal the true mindset of the era, a world governed by a complex web of honor, law, profit, and a profound belief in the supernatural. The legends of the Blood Eagle may be just that, legends. But the reality unearthed by the archaeologist's trowel is of a violence that was intimate, methodical, and deeply meaningful to those who perpetrated it. We are left with the silent skulls in a Dorset pit, the ambiguous verses of a vengeful poem, and the unsettling knowledge that for our ancestors, death was not the end of the war. It was simply the beginning of a new and far more macabre phase of the conflict. The most terrifying stories are not written in runes, but in bone,